We are a Digital Spies movie team, and we're here to talk about all things the Batman.
We're going to be going into that major cameo at the end and whether it is who you think it is, what Riddler's grand plan was for Gotham City, so obviously there will be major spoilers ahead. So, after Batman foils Riddler's grand plan for Gotham, we cut back to Riddler in Arkham State Hospital, where he's talking to an unseen prisoner that could be who we think it is. But before we get into that, let's see what Matt Reeves had to say about it when we asked him about that scene.
You know, I wanted this to be one complete experience. Like, you don't set out to make chapter 1 without knowing if you'll ever get to make chapter 2. But the story of Batman never ends, right? So you want to leave it in a place where the story continues, because it's as if saying, like, well, he solved the problem. There's no more crime in Gotham. There's no more corruption. And it's like, well, that doesn't have any basis in any reality. That's why Gotham is so relevant, is that there's never a time when corruption and crime are not something, unfortunately, that are part of our world. And so the idea of having an ending that speaks of the continuation is to say that, and Batman lives on. And actually, it isn't really the scene you're talking about, that's meant to say, like, that's the next movie or that's the character we're going to do. It was more this idea of a tease and a nod to people who love this world, to say, like, oh my gosh, I think that's that character. And he's not even called the character you're referring to. He's the unseen prisoner, because the idea is that it's meant to kind of tease you and say, like, is that what that is?
That prisoner was played by Barry Keoghan, and sorry, Barry, if we got your surname wrong there. But before the release, there was rumours that he was playing a certain iconic DC villain. So that's Joker, right?
I mean, I definitely thought it was pretty obvious it was Joker. But then, obviously, with what Matt Reeves has kind of made it more ambiguous with his quotes. So I think, you know, it could be Joker, and then it could be somebody else entirely. I think it gives it that flexibility, which is good. But it's also a bit like wishy-washy at the same time.
Yeah, it feels like with all the dialogue about him, there's worse things than being a clown. Like, it's clearly, and the little laugh afterwards as well, it's clearly aimed to be Joker.
Right.
And every previous Batman has had a Joker. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I do wonder if some people will feel that this is too soon again to have a Joker after we had Joaquin Phoenix's version. But I think that flexibility allows them to maybe go in a different direction.
Yeah.
Maybe it can be someone completely different.
Or they could just hold him in prison for the next film. You know, if there's a sequel, which it seems like there will be, they could just keep him in the hospital, have somebody else entirely, and then save him for a third film if we're, you know, once we get down that route. And I think that would be an easy way of kind of holding back if the appetite for another Joker seems lower, which I think in a way you're right, it is. We've had a lot of overload of Joker content, my least favorite word.
But yeah, we have had that. And obviously Heath Ledger is seen as many to be the definitive version. Some people obviously are more the Jack Nicholson, but it feels like in this crowd and these fans of this film will probably be more along the Heath Ledger lines. I think the problem is that obviously with Joaquin Phoenix's version, that got into all controversies over its treatment of mental health and all those kind of things. So I would hope that if Reeves goes down this route in the sequel or in a future spin-off or something like that, that he avoids those kind of things. Like, I think it's okay for the Joker to just be Joker. Like, it's okay for him to be, he's clearly already established. In that little bit we see of him, he looks like he's got that smile on. So it feels like he's already Joker, and this isn't going to be an origin story for Joker if we see him again.
Yeah, absolutely.
But a team up with Riddler is exciting because Paul Dano is incredible in the role. And seeing them two team up, because Barry Keoghan is a very charismatic actor, so it's exciting to imagine what he could bring to this kind of role. In a sequel, or just have him hanging out, have him be like a little cameo. It just pops up every now and then. But I did think it was interesting how Reeves didn't make that a credit scene, because there is no credit scene here. We get the little bit at the end that Riddler's website comes up and he just wishes goodbye to everyone. But that's the kind of thing that, say, the MCU or even some other DC films, you'd expect to have to wait around. And I think the fact that it comes before the end does highlight his idea of, like, this world just continues on. Like, there are these bad people. Like, Gotham isn't saved. Like, if anything, it's in a worse place at the end than it is in the beginning. So I think that's just quite interesting the way you handled that. We won't go into all the details of why Riddler is doing what he's doing to Gotham City, but essentially it's to expose the corruption in the city that extends to Carmine Falcone and the GCPD, and also, surprisingly, to Thomas Wayne, who, when a reporter was threatening to expose Martha's past, asked Falcone to help deal with it, which essentially led to the reporter's death. Thomas was racked with guilt over this and threatened to expose Falcone, which potentially led to their death. But I thought it was interesting how, where we've seen the Waynes before, they're these holier-than-thou billionaires, which doesn't really fit within Reeves' grounded world and this take on Batman. So I thought it was interesting that, you know, he was a flawed human. He'd made mistakes in the past, which could be controversial for some fans, but I liked it. What about you?
Yeah, I think it made it feel more realistic. And I think also, because Matt Reeves was very adamant that he wasn't going to rehash the death of the parents and not glorify their murder as the thing that made, you know, Bruce into Batman as this kind of inciting incident. I think that was a really good way of still showing the impacts that your parents and the choices that they make have on you as a person. Obviously, their deaths were a big deal for him, but I think more important was the discovery that his father wasn't the man that he thought he was, which is a realization we all come to about our parents. Usually it's not because of the Riddler, right? But there is always a point where we realize that our parents are fallible and flawed human beings. And I think that's a much more realistic emotional arc for Bruce to go through in the film than having to live up to, you know, his father being the paragon of you know, a philanthropist saving Gotham and everything like that. So I definitely thought it was much more interesting. And also in particular, I think, like you said, I mean, you can't have a good billionaire, right? I mean, I could wax poetical about how awful capitalism is forever, but this is not the video for that. But I think it made it feel more realistic, especially within Gotham, because, you know, obviously it's a city that is falling apart. So I think it makes more sense that the people meant to save it are also flawed themselves.
Yeah, and also indirectly responsible for what's happened because it's their recovery fund that leads to it. And also, I just feel like it allowed, as you say, it allowed them to explore the death of Bruce's parents and make it part of the story without having to see them being shot outside the theatre or the pearls on the floor and all that kind of stuff. It still informs Bruce's journey. And I think if you know Batman, you'll know where it comes from and you know how they got killed. And this whole thing with Falcone, who maybe Maroni did it, maybe a thug did it, I think that is quite good that it feeds into this whole thing of like who did kill Bruce's parents, and it feeds into the detective storyline of this whole film.
But I think also at the same point, it doesn't rely so much on the idea that there's one person or one entity responsible for it that Batman has to then go thwart. Yeah. Because it is much more sad, really, and difficult to internalize that it could have just been random violence. Do you know what I mean? And I think that the unknowing element of it feels much more realistic and more difficult, because it would be easier to be like, well, all right, Falcone did it and he's a jerk and now I'm going to kill him and there's my vengeance. You know, it's done. I've done it. I've accomplished it. But this is a lot more difficult because really what killed his parents is Gotham, right? Yeah. Is the seediness of Gotham and the way that it kind of pulls you under. And so in order for him to work through his feelings about that, it comes hand in hand with trying to save Gotham at the end. And he says it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I have to, you know, do everything I can to help Gotham get through that transition period. Yeah. That's going to be his, I feel like I'm a psychotherapist. I'm analyzing Batman. That's going to be his journey through dealing with the death of his parents and his place in Gotham and the legacy of the city.
And as part of this whole plan, it eventually leads to Riddler thinking that he can work with Batman to expose the corruption in Gotham, because he sees Batman going around the city, fighting crime, fighting criminals, and he thinks, oh yeah, you know, maybe we're not as different as we thought we were. But obviously he's unaware, or is he, that Batman is Bruce Wayne. What do you feel?
See, I thought he didn't know Batman was Bruce Wayne. And the reason I think that is because he does that really creepy thing in Arkham where he's like, Bruce Wayne. It was so freaking creepy.
Before his Ave Maria performance.
Before the Ave Maria thing.
Can't get out of my head.
Oh my God. Good. But then he doesn't ever actually say, I know you're Bruce Wayne or you are Bruce Wayne. And then he keeps going on about still taking down that kind of corruption. And I think if he knew Batman was Bruce Wayne, this person that because Bruce is the person that he envied growing up in the orphanage, right? And Bruce is the person that he saw, you know, oh, Bruce is being referred to as an orphan. I'm really an orphan. He had all this money and support. Exactly. So I think if he knew Batman and Bruce Wayne were the same person, he might not have felt that same kind of kinship with him necessarily. And also, I think he picks Batman to help him because he's also an outsider. And Bruce Wayne isn't really, even though he's a recluse. Yeah,
you know, he's an emo.
Yeah, he's an emo as well.
We can just say it. We can just say he's an emo in this film, but that's totally fine as well.
Love emo Batman. Till the day I die. I think it makes more sense that he doesn't fundamentally actually know that, even if he maybe subconsciously suspects it. I don't think he really has put those two things together.
Yeah, because his whole thing as well, because obviously this meeting in Arkham comes before the Riddler's set off the bombs that have flooded Gotham, and he says something along the lines of, we're going to be safe here with Batman as Batman. So you feel if he does necessarily know that, then if he knew he was Bruce, then he wouldn't save him, surely. But
well, yeah, because he's trying to punish him for the sins of the father.
Yeah, and he does attack Bruce earlier on in the film, or he tries to, and it's Alfred who is the target of the letter bomb in the end, but survives. So if he did know this, it's just part of me. There was this whole thing about how Riddler and Edward Nashton was a forensic accountant, and that's how he worked out all this corruption within Gotham. And surely at some point you come across that and you're like, well, Batman's clearly got like loads of money. Like, must be someone that no one knows in this city, and therefore he's got access to all these things, and he souped up his car. Maybe something's there subconsciously that Batman could be Bruce Wayne, especially after he saves the day.
Yeah.
And watches him on TV in The Riddler with that scene we mentioned earlier. But yeah, it's not 100% implied that he definitely knows it. Right. And really, why would anyone connect Bruce with Batman? Because Bruce in this film is not out in the open apart from that funeral scene. Otherwise, he's just nowhere there. He's moping in the shadows with these eyeshadow.
Yes.
So the Batman ends with Gotham City flooded and Batman out in the open helping citizens and hopefully starting to make Gotham a better place. Batman and Catwoman have one final goodbye where she decides that she's going off to Bloodhaven, which could well be a setup for Nightwing in the sequel or something else to come, while Batman decides to stay behind because even though he knows Gotham is pretty wrecked, he hopes that it can get better and he hopes that he can do better. Robert Pattinson has said he's got 2 more movies planned out in terms of Bruce's psychology and where he's going to go, but currently there's no sequel planned yet. Are you excited to see what Pattinson can bring next to the role and where he goes?
Yes.
Just
1,000 times yes, just because he's emo Batman. No, I mean, like I said before, I think exploring psychology is going to be interesting. I find that stuff interesting. I think it's a lot more interesting than a guy putting on a bat suit and beating up criminals. And I think that's what made Reeves' Batman so much more interesting, is that there was psychology to explore beyond I'm just an emo billionaire beat up bad guys. This was more, there was more meat to the character, and I think exploring that will be interesting. I also think what I liked about this one, and that it'll be interesting to see how and if it's done again, is the way that Reeves loops in kind of contemporary issues into the arc of the villain. So obviously you've got Riddler using social media, kind of inciting others to follow in his footsteps, which was very, reminding me a lot of like kind of the incel movements and extremism that you find in online spaces. And I think it was so well illustrated without being browbeating. There wasn't, it wasn't super heavy-handed. It was, if you saw it, you saw it. And if you didn't, I'm sure there's nothing missed there. It didn't have to be something that was in a neon sign. If you noticed it, that was an interesting thread that you could tease out. So it'll be interesting to see what he does in a potential sequel, how his villains will inform the arc of the story in terms of kind of the narrative drive of it. And I think, Batman's, as he works through his psychology, it will butt up against those issues, because I think that's what's most interesting about this film, and I hope that would be repeated in the sequel. So I would love to see my baby emo Arpats come back as Batman.
Bats, I think you mean.
Bats.
Yeah. But I think it's also interesting that in this film, we don't really see much of Bruce Wayne, as we were saying earlier. Like, he very much is in the shadows himself as much as he is when he's hunting criminals as Batman. So I think if he, in this next film, hypothetical next film, if it comes, if we see more of Bruce and exploring that side, it will allow him to dig into more of those issues. Yeah. While maybe having like a direct villain for Batman, because in this, Riddler isn't the Batman's enemy. He doesn't view him as his enemy, and they're never butting heads. Riddler's very much his enemy is Gotham City. So it'll be interesting if Batman actually gets someone to go up against. Right. Whether it's Joker, if it is Joker, or whether it's someone completely different. Because in the comics, in No Man's Land, which happens after an earthquake, Gotham, like this film, is cut off from the world, and then the various villains work out different areas of Gotham themselves. So you get like Mr. Freeze and the likes of them in there, which seems unlikely that Reeves' vision would fit someone like Mr. Freeze, but it can happen, like in the sequel, if he decides to take inspiration from that. Before we get to any potential sequel on the big screen, though, we will be visiting Gotham City again in 2 planned TV series. One about Gotham City Police Department potentially set before the Batman and a little bit after, and also a Penguin series set after the Batman, because now that Falcone's dead, Oswald Cobblepot can rise to the Penguin, which he never really becomes in this film. And I'm excited, I don't know about you, to see more of Colin Farrell, even if you definitely can't tell him in there. Like, I genuinely had to keep reminding myself during this film that is Colin Farrell under all of this incredible makeup and prosthetics.
I'm excited to go back to Gotham. It's funny, when I watched the film, and quite early on, the camera kind of follows Batman under an elevated train. And I had this moment, I thought, oh, that reminds me of home. I'm from New York City. And that was depressing as hell, but, que sera. I'm excited to go back to Gotham and see particularly how Gotham PD is framed, because obviously this is taking place in an era where we have a hyper scrutiny of police, the way police behave, both in the States and also here in the UK. And I think it'll be really fascinating to see how that's tackled, because, in the film, beside Gordon and a couple of other cops at the end, there's that great scene where he comes out with Falcone and he says, not all of us, not all of us are dirty, and there's a sea of cops.
But most
there.
of them were wrong ones.
But most of them were,
total wrong ones. On the payroll.
On the payroll. No, you would not. So it'll be interesting to see that dynamic and how that plays out in the show. But yeah, I'm definitely excited to return to Gotham. I think, Penguin... my favorite scene, I think, in the entire film is when he's shackled and he waddles away like Penguin. And I just thought that is freaking hilarious. There's a lot of good moments of comedy in this film. You wouldn't think it, but there is. Yeah. And so it'll be interesting to see how Colin Farrell develops the villain, because even though he's not really Penguin yet, in the sense that he hasn't risen to that kind of criminal height of taking over the drug operation and all that stuff, he still feels like a fully fleshed out character. Yeah. I don't know how much room there is for character development in that role. So it'll be interesting to see how that falls out. I'm most interested, really, perhaps unsurprisingly, in seeing Catwoman and seeing her development.
And there is reports of potentially a Catwoman series as well. So
that I would be totally down for, because I think that character is interesting, and I think Zoe Kravitz has come out saying that she played her as bisexual. Yeah. It's only kind of hinted at in the film, and for me, I felt like that was a bit of a missed opportunity, because it's so subtle that it's easily missed. Again, Yeah,
I mean, she's fairly. To be fair, she isn't in it a lot, and also the flatmate that she's living with, who is implied that they might have had a relationship or something in the past. Like, she's dead.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's no opportunity.
Not the greatest queer representation.
She didn't really interact with any other female characters, anyone other than Batman, really, during this film.
Which I didn't mind exploring Selina and Bruce, or Batman and Catwoman, because she doesn't know he's Bruce. I liked their dynamic. I thought it was very interesting. It played into those film noir kind of roles in a nice way, in a way that was engaging and entertaining. It'll be more, I think, engaging to see her develop as a character in her own rights, as a vigilante, as a thief, all of those elements that are there that she hasn't actually realized yet in the film. So I think, compared to Penguin, my money would be on Catwoman in terms of it being a more engaging character to develop. Yeah. So that's what I'm most excited for.
I'm just most excited to see what Italian-American stereotype that Colin Farrell is going to do next, because every single line of his series, that is going to be there.
Cobblepot is not an Italian. This is hilarious.
It felt like he knew he was hidden under this, and maybe a few years' time, when everyone's either moved on from the Batman or there's like the 10th different version on screen by then, it felt like he knew people were going to look back on this film and just totally forget it was him. So I was like,
may as well just go for it.
It's like sweetheart, it's like everything different.
All of my relatives in New York rolling in their graves.
Were you offended by that?
No, I was not. I thought it was See, all right, look, Colin Farrell as Penguin, fine. Jared Leto in House of Gucci, not fine. We'll hold those two.
That's the scale. We've got one end or the other.
There was the scene when Bruce, Bruce comes to meet Falcone to get the skinny. And John Turturro's standing there in his little cardigan, and I just went, wow, that reminds me of my grandfather. And it was just the funniest moment, because I thought, there are some things that transcend, and that Italian-Americanness it is a thing. Look, it's a thing. Yeah. I wasn't offended by any of it. I thought it was hilarious.
We don't actually know yet if Jeffrey Wright is going to reprise his role as James Gordon in the series. But, I mean, I'd hope that we get to see James Gordon and Jeffrey Wright's version become Commissioner Gordon that we have in the comics, even if it's not in the TV series, but in the sequel as well.
Yeah, I mean, he's Lieutenant, I think, in the film, so he's still got quite a ways to go. It'll be interesting to see him, as Batman's kind of only ally in the GCPD, to see him rise through the ranks and how that could change their relationship. I think that'll be super interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I bonded with Jeffrey Wright because he's an Arsenal fan like myself.
I won a bet with our first AD, who's a Tottenham supporter, or as we say in America sometimes, Tottenham. And I'm an Arsenal supporter. So yeah. So right after we wrapped, Arsenal beat Spurs, and so he owes me Gordon's badge, his GCPD badge, which I've yet to receive, as is probably typical of a Tottenham supporter.
Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos, including interviews with the cast of The Batman.